wouldn't you say? But certainly appreciate it. It is indeed my great honor to have the opportunity to be with all of you here this eve and to hopefully engage you in discourse. I look forward to a little bit later in this evening when we shall be able to take some questions from you, because there is no more important thing for the chief magistrate of the nation than to entertain the questions, curiosities, and conundrums of his fellow citizens. I must also tell you that I'm greatly honored to be here in the Northwest Territories, which is curious to me considering I don't think I've ever been beyond the Ohio Valley before. Do you have any idea how many days it took me to ride out here? But that is a conversation for another time. For now, we are honoring the Constitution of these United States of America. Of course, the Constitution is the document that fulfills the promise that was made by our Declaration of American Independence. But I will also tell you that my mind spins back to an even earlier time. Mrs. Washington will tell you that depending on how one looks at the coin, I am either blessed or cursed. And that is because I tend to remember everything. For example, I remember being a very loyal and happy British subject. Now that might be surprising to many of you, but it was the case. We had all the rights and privileges and franchises of Englishmen, at least those that were important to us, and our lordly masters in Great Britain pretty much left us alone here in British America, the American colonies, for nigh on 150 years, going back to the 1600s. I was such a loyal subject that I served His Majesty. I fought for king and country during the 7 Years' War, although it had a bit of a different name here in British America. You know the name? The French and Indian War. I actually served as an officer in the Virginia Regiment. I was hailed a hero, although, if truth be told, much of what I was hailed a hero for came out of the brash acts of being such a youthful officer. I wrote to one of my brothers, a younger brother, after a battle I had led against the French. I wrote, "I have heard the bullets whistle, and believe me, there is something charming in the sound." That comment made it all the way back to the King of England himself. The King of England said that if Colonel Washington, I was a colonel at the time, if Colonel Washington, he said, had been hit by that bullet, his attitude would have been very different. Ultimately, the British were successful in kicking out the French from North America, from what we clearly saw as British land. But before I resigned my commission as Commander-in-Chief of all the forces of Virginia, I would be struck by the manner in which our lordly masters, and particularly the British military aristocracy, felt and treated American colonials. Do you know that as a colonel in the Virginia Regiment, my orders could be overturned by a lieutenant in the British regular army? This was my first understanding of the arrogance of our British lordly masters. But it was soon forgotten. I married a fine and good lady, the widow of Colonel Daniel Custis, Martha Dandridge Custis. On 12th night, 1759, she became Mrs. Washington. We had 16 uninterrupted years at Mount Vernon. She will refer to it as the golden years. And then everything changed in 1764. My life would be turned upside down. I would be yanked out of the life of a Virginia gentleman farmer and thrust into a world, a storm that no one could have ever predicted. What caused that change? You see, it is really very simple. The king in 1764 opens up his treasury and he sees it is nigh on empty. He has a fit. He turns to his ministers, tells them to do something about it. They put their heads together and they suggest the following to the King of England. Your Majesty, we have just finished fighting a very expensive war against the French. Most of the cost of that war was incurred in British America, in the colonies. Let us turn to the American colonials. We will refill your counting room. That was a brilliant idea on face value. The problem is, however, that our lord and masters did not understand us in America a whit. And the second problem is they tried to achieve their means with an iron fist forced down our throats. I do not need to recount for you the 11 years of systematic tyranny, the stripping of our liberties, the usurpation of our freedoms, the constant reaching into our purses. Ultimately, we can stand it no longer. Gentlemen from 13 separate countries come together, and it is critical to your understanding of all of these events that you are clear about the fact that we were absolute strangers to each other. You could spend your entire life in your country of Virginia and never set foot in the country of Maryland or the country of North Carolina. We come together, and one thing leads to another, to the point where we agree to raise up arms against our king, something that no colony in the history of humankind had ever done successfully. And we were going to do it against the most powerful fighting force in the entire world, the British Army and the British Navy. I also do not need to tell you about the outcome of that great and glorious contest. I will simply tell you that when I was commissioned as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army of the United Colonies of America, we would not declare independence for 13 months. I wrote a letter to my beloved Mrs. Washington. I told her, after enclosing a copy of my will, that I would be home for Christmas Eve. Wrote the letter in mid-June 1775. I would be home for Christmas Eve. I did not tell her which one. I literally walked across the threshold of our home at Mount Vernon on Christmas Eve, 8.5 years later, without ever taking a single day's furlough during the entire War of American Independence. We as a people raise up this nation. We are successful. We defeat the British. And then we had to ask ourselves what kind of country we should be. Make no mistake about it, there were a wide range of options and opinions, including those who wanted to make me what? The king. King George I of America. You can understand this thinking, can you not? At the time that we declare our American independency on July 2nd, 1776, I'm getting some looks here. You do know that the question of our independence was voted upon on July 2nd, 1776. It was adopted on July 4th, 1776, read to the public on the 8th. Mr. John Adams said, July 2nd will long be remembered in this country with parades and illuminations. Well, he was only off by 2 days. But at the time we declare our American independence, and again at the time that we ratify our Constitution, we are the only country in the entirety of this world, the only country on earth, that is not under the control of men and women of absolute power. Every other nation on the planet is under the control of kings and queens and lords and ladies and sheiks and viziers and potentates and maharajas and mikados and emperors, even a czarina. We alone raise up a nation of laws that ultimately empowers all of its people. And those laws are embodied in the Constitution of the United States of America. That is what we are here to remember. I hope you will find this evening interesting as we engage not only in discourse with ourselves, where you can see as Mr. Jefferson calls it, the dynamic tension that exists in this great experiment of ours, but that we will be able to hear from you as well. My friends, it is at this time my greatest honor and privilege to introduce to you my Minister of Foreign Affairs. You would call him the Secretary of State. And from what I have been told, although I find it bewildering, the gentleman who actually served as the third President of these United States, Mr. Thomas Jefferson, please.
Yourself, indeed, resplendent as always in your uniform, and please know, regardless of what high office I may ever attain, I continue to remain your humble and obedient servant.
Thank you, sir. Please.
Good evening, citizens. Good evening. Oh, they are there. What a delight it is to have the opportunity to follow His Excellency so far into the Western Territories, into what Your Excellency recall we had always called Western Virginia. Here and read about the Great Lakes and that particular one of Michigan. Citizens, I look forward to our confabs this evening, our confabulations, our conversation upon any subject that you would delight to put forth for our general interest. Indeed, the conversation provided by your questions, an open and free inquiry. That has always been my greatest delight, and one we must never ever shirk as the American citizenry, because it is the public conversation, it is the public argument, it is the public debate more than anything else which will continue to preserve, protect, and defend our natural rights. And I hope we well understand that these are the rights that are given to us, and I mean not only as Americans. These are the rights that are given to the family of man across this globe, not by any government and not by any ruler. These are the rights that are given to mankind by nature and nature's God. So how well we incur His favor and engage His benevolence. When we engage these rights, or rest you assured, if we do not, well, as history has shown, we may lose them. So I welcome your questions, your curiosities, and your concerns this evening, as I have welcomed the opportunity to venture so far here and to be in your presence, and again, once more, in your presence. Is it not one of the most remarkable, unrecorded moments in our nation's history that we should be all together tonight and to reflect upon a remarkable history and that remarkable document that we have contrived? Do you know that September 1787, I was not there at the Constitutional Convention. In fact, would anyone know where I was?
France.
I was in France. I was serving as our nation's second minister plenipotentiary at the court of His Majesty, King Louis XVI. And I will tell you this, when I received from Mr. Madison that remarkable document in a letter that he sent me the following November of '87, I wrote back to him immediately, I am captivated by this document, truly the shortest of its kind in human history, creating a government to check its own power, providing the greater power in the legislative body, truly that body elected directly by whom? The people. And particularly, the beauty of its prologue. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, is that not unique in human history, that the people admit their government is not perfect, that we continue to strive and struggle to form a more perfect union, to continue to remind ourselves that we achieved something most unique indeed in human history, to bring together 13 individual nations Not only for our common safety, surely, yes, not only for our common defense, but most importantly, for the common good. To think that we engage the ancient arguments which have occupied man from time immemorial, arguments relative to his eternal struggle for liberty, to engage those arguments freely, and therefore not to answer them, but truly to provide in the victory of our American Revolution the opportunity for man to prove that he is capable of self-government. That is what we call the American experiment. Citizens, as I dismounted out of doors, I took off my riding boots, I put on my shoes, and I thought, well, I'll be observed by you all as rather musty and dusty from the saddle, perhaps peculiarly apparelled. So I conjured up an apology for you, and yet as I was venturing down the aisle and then ascended the dais and turned about to gaze amongst all of you, Your Excellency, I do not know why any apology from me is necessary tonight. I've always believed in dressing for comfort, but you overwhelm me in that regard. And now I find I'm rather overdressed. Overdressed in what has become rather the peculiar cut of a gentleman's suit of clothes since the turn of the century. Oh, since the dawn of the 19th century, perhaps you've noticed gentlemen have been cutting away their old frock coats, their frocks so fashionable before, during, after the American Revolution, buttoning right down to their knees. You rarely see them any longer. Gentlemen cutting away the points of their waistcoats, and I declare without the excess of material. Well, this is far more comfortable in the saddle. Oh, I'm never a day out of the saddle. And that old tri-corner hat, well, you rarely see them any longer, with the exception, I dare say, of Williamsburg, Virginia, where they're still worn as an honorarium to the past. But no, gentlemen are now sporting these top hats, growing ever the higher. And yet you can see I'm still old-fashioned. I still enjoy wearing breeches. Very comfortable in breeches, Your Excellency. Easy to put on your boots, easy to take them off, easy to be seated in the saddle. I have not succumbed to this gentleman's fashion of pantaloons buttoning all the way down to the ankles. In fact, I declare even some of the women folk are sporting them here this evening. You must be from France, are you? Ever at the forefront of fashion, they are. I beg your pardon, citizens. Lest you think your Chief Magistrate has lost his mind to stand here and ruminate upon fashion and style. No, lest you think indeed I do not own up to what the Federalists continue to chastise me and place upon me, that I am somewhat of an American Sphinx. Have you heard that? Lofty, reserved, inapproachable, silent. Many of my good friends, my family, know me to be incessant in conversation, to enjoy confab, particularly jocularity. No, rest you assured, I have not lost my mind to comment and ruminate upon fashion and style, no more than the rest. It is an element of our human nature that I welcome. Even in the worst of times, it preoccupies us. What is the other wearing? Will we properly conform? Nay, indeed. Perhaps you've read as I have written. When it comes to fashion, swim with the current. But when it comes to principle, stand like a rock. And that is what we are recognizing this anniversary of our Constitution of the United States, recognizing the safety, the security, the protection, and the defense of the principles over which we engaged our American Revolution. First and foremost, to freely engage the arguments that have occupied mankind throughout its history. And secondly, to recognize the principles within our Declaration of American Independence. And even though I have been accounted indeed with great honorarium as the author, do you know I have often said there's not one new or original thought in the Declaration of our American Independence. All of it has been written and argued and debated before, and you may find it in the elementary books of public right. The works of Aristotle, Cicero, Algernon said, and John Locke. What I attempted to do with the jottings of my pen, what the committee attempted to do in their review of it, and what our Continental Congress engaged to do as well, was simply to shed the lofty sophisms and explain it all in clear and simple terms so that everyone might understand it, so that it might be comprehended in the great diversity of our population, and I've always said that diversity is our greatest strength, and to place before the world the common sense of the matter. And that matter is simply that the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a few booted and spurred, ready to ride it. And yet, you know, the most remarkable principle of our American Revolution was seen well before that revolution began. It was seen in the recognition of who we were becoming. The recognition that though we were governed by one particular royal family, generation after generation, governed by their particular parliament, one half of which is hereditary as well, and governed by their particular church. Well, I ask you, was it only the Englishman seeking an asylum here in North America? No, who else was venturing here? The Dutch, the industrious Dutch, settling up the Hudson, providing great prosperity in the port of New York, others. The Germans from the many kingdoms of the Germans, proving to be our most industrious farmers. Do you know, as we meet here this evening, the predominant population in the new Commonwealth of Pennsylvania remains German. Others. Yes, the Scotch-Irish. They'd never want to be considered British, would they? Any more than the Irish or the Scots in themselves. Imagine the Spaniards. Oh, here well before the British or any others, the French, the mortal enemy of England, seeking an asylum here, claiming a great deal of our continent as their own. We know some from the Italians, some from the Russians, some from the Orient, the Hebrews, seeking a new promised land and citizens. Who can deny the African? Not a one of us should deny the great majority were brought here against their will, and yet as well, not a one should deny they have been settled here from the earliest days, have they not, with everybody else? And therefore, surely, what we began to realize is the simple fact, quite evident indeed, though governed by the British monarchy thousands of miles removed, here in America we were becoming the less and less British, and the more and more self-evident. And I ask you, my fellow Americans, where or when does that end? Why the hesitation? Boldly spoken, it never ends. Indeed, many of you seated here tonight, descendant of those who sought these shores generations ago, others recently arrived, and so it will continue. Nati naturam habilis unto generations yet unborn. I have written, shall oppressed humanity find no asylum on this globe? We are that asylum. We ever have been. And by whose providence? Look about you, my fellow Americans. You will see a greater representation of the family of man than perhaps any nation may boast. All here recognizing our natural right to engage those rights given to us by our Creator. Particularly, indeed, our talents given to us by Him, one different from the other, by which we not only pursue our happiness, but improve the condition of our lives, that of our fellow man. Truly, citizens, the beauty of our Declaration is fulfilled in the beauty of our Constitution, which continues to grow with us as we grow as a people. For I have always said, a child of 14 cannot wear the same clothes at the age of 40. And so our laws and institutions grow with us accordingly. I thank you, Your Excellency. I thank you, my fellow citizens. I look forward to your questions. But now, what an honorarium. What a pleasure for me to introduce a gentleman that I have become acquainted with. Oh, I was struck with his surname when they told it to me. Your Excellency, I thought it was indeed an immediate relative of the hero of our revolution, General Benjamin Lincoln.
Oh, the gentleman who received the sword at surrender.
Precisely. Or I thought perhaps he was an immediate relative of my first Attorney General, Levi Lincoln of Massachusetts. But no, rather, as I understand, he is a relation of the two aforementioned. This gentleman was born the last few months of my presidency, and he is with us this evening. Gentlemen and ladies, please welcome the 16th President of our United States, Abraham Lincoln.
To my ancestry and how they connected with your respective administrations and your work in the revolutionary context. I have a feeling that these people know that the Lincolns had migrated out to Kentucky and that I would be born there, 2 states south of where we are tonight in 1809, the year you left the presidency, as you said. And I did my little bit of education in a one-room log cabin school in Indiana, down very close to the Ohio River. So I was your distant neighbor. People remember me when I went to Illinois in 1830. I was 21 years old. I had an interest in the law, and I had a little bit of interest in politics. And I would eventually become an attorney, self-made, so to speak. I was held on retainer by the Illinois Central Railroad. And I got involved in politics. We had 2 major parties. The Democrats were the party of President Andrew Jackson, and another party started in opposition to Jackson, mostly over banking and finance, and they were called the Whigs, party of Daniel Webster, Henry Clay. That was the party that I belonged to. And I knew defeat and I knew victory in running for the Illinois legislature, and then to the U.S. Congress in 1847, where I would meet Hezekiah Wells from Kalamazoo, and later I would be invited by Hezekiah Wells to make my one trip to Michigan, and that would be in 1856. Let me get to that in this way. I came home from the Congress in 1847, 48, 49. I had been there 2 years. Devastating news awaited me. I planned to take up my law practice. But after being gone those 2 years, why, when I returned, they said, well, now, Mr. Lincoln, we have 12 lawyers at work here. 12? Why, my heart sunk. Could you ever imagine a town of 3,900 people with 12 lawyers? Well, I would have to ride the circuit to find business, and I traveled to distant counties in Illinois, and I tried cases at the courthouses in different counties, and I was in that until 1854. Now, in 1854, the land that Mr. Jefferson had procured in 1803, we had called it the Louisiana Purchase. But all those acres he purchased from France were west of the Mississippi River, and they started to carve territories out of that purchase. And in 1820, a territory called Missouri applied for statehood, but they wanted to come into our union with slaves. Slavery was legal by the Constitution in the southern states. It was horrible, but it was legal by the Constitution. And now they're going to let it jump across the Mississippi River. At the same time, they drew a line, 36 degrees and 30 minutes north latitude, going from the west bank of the Mississippi out through the territory Jefferson purchased. They called it the Missouri Compromise Line, and I reckon if you looked at your maps today, you'd say, why, that goes about halfway through Colorado. And it was going to be legal to have slaves south of that line, and it was going to be illegal to have them north of that line. Now, here came the problem in 1854. Out in Illinois, it came from my state. We had an ambitious Democratic senator there. His name was Stephen A. Douglas. And he thought, sure, at the next election he could get to the White House. But then he realized he couldn't get to the White House without Southern votes. So in 1854, he put forth a bill in Congress that would do away with the Missouri Compromise Line. It would let Southern planters take their slaves all the way up to the Canadian border, west of what we call Minnesota and Iowa. Slavery was never to go there. And Douglas went all around the state of Illinois, and his state too, of course, saying, no, we can't keep these good men from taking their slaves northwest, we'll just change the law. When he spoke like that, I came out of my law office. I spoke to large crowds around our city, our state. I said, wake up, don't let Douglas get away with this. If we say that we're against slavery, right now we're limited as to what we can do. Our government tells us slavery's legal south of the Mason-Dixon line, south of the Ohio River, south of that new Missouri Compromise line. We're certainly intelligent. We're law-abiding citizens. So we must say to the government, we're not here to break any law, but we are here to see that you never let slavery span one more mile. We know, we understand it's legal where it is. It's our job to restrict it there. And if we can keep it contained, somewhere in our future, we're always going to have the hope that the majority of our citizens will come to their senses. And they'll say slavery is built on poor morality, terrible economics, and they'll choose to get rid of it. But if we fall asleep and let Senator Douglas get slaves into the Northwest, we could wake up in 2 years and read the headlines in the Chicago Tribune, the United States now a slave nation. And when I talk like that, I got a following in our northern states, I got hatred in the South. But that year, up in Jackson, Michigan, leaders of my Whigs got together with another Douglas, Frederick Douglass, former slave, escaped, made his way up to Rochester, New York, became the leader of the abolitionists. His abolitionist leaders, my Whigs, the Free Soilers, and the American Party came together because they hated slavery. And they cast the old names aside, formed a new party they called the Republicans. Later, I became a Republican leader out in Illinois, and Douglas, who didn't get to the White House, had to come up for re-election in 1858 to the Senate. And those Illinois Republicans put me up to run again. And that's where we held those Lincoln-Douglas debates. The outcome was that he won. He went back to Washington City. But the next year, 1859, I was asked to come speak about slavery. Ohio, in Wisconsin, even at the Cooper Union in Manhattan. And then in 1860, the new Republican Party held their convention in Chicago, and they nominated me, and people sang a little song about me. Old Abe Lincoln came out of the wilderness down in Illinois. 10 slave states didn't even put my name on the ballot. The division within the Democratic Party, Douglas ran for the North, Buchanan for the South. He'd let me win. But when I did win, South Carolina said, we don't stay in a country whose president won't let us take our slaves northwest. And they would secede. And this Constitution that we've talked about tonight, I didn't think it allowed a state to secede. But that's what they did. And 6 others would follow. So when I gave my inaugural address, I said, the Union is perpetual, as proclaimed by the history of the Union itself. The Union is much older than the Constitution. It was formed, in fact, by the Articles of Association in 1774. It was matured and continued by our Declaration of Independence in 1776. It was further matured in the faith of all the then 13 states expressly plighted and engaged that it should be perpetual by the Articles of Confederation in 1778. And finally, in 1787, one of the declared objects for ordaining and establishing the Constitution was to form a more perfect union. And war would follow. 87,000 men from Michigan would leave their homes and jobs and go away to join the Army, Navy, Marine Corps. Some of them on this date, September 17, 1862, would be with General George B. McClellan at a place called Antietam Creek in Maryland. And there they would meet Robert E. Lee in what developed with the bloodiest single-day battle of the war. It turned out to be a Union victory. It gave me a political platform to stand upon and issue the Emancipation Proclamation. This war was going to go on for 30 more months. But I've always said the first step for freedom for the black man and woman in this country started September 17, 1862, with that victory at Antietam, which then in turn let me issue the Emancipation Proclamation.
Oh, the war would go on for 30 more months, but about 9 months later, many of your brave Michigan men, including George Armstrong Custer from Monroe, including the Iron Brigade, which was made up of men from Michigan, Wisconsin, and certainly Indiana, they would meet the Confederates again under Robert E. Lee at a place called Gettysburg. And after a terrible 3-day battle, then on the 4th of July, our nation's birthday, Robert E. Lee, outstanding general he was, had to retreat back to the safety of Virginia. The same day, a general by the name of Grant took Vicksburg on the Mississippi, and now we would have that river flowing free to the Gulf of Mexico. But still the war would go on. And 4.5 months later, they called me to Gettysburg to have a part in dedicating the cemetery there. And I would sit on a platform with a number of northern governors, including your governor, Mr. Blair. And he would hear me say 7 years ago, I was referring back to the 4th of July and this man Jefferson, what he had given us as our Declaration of Independence. Well, the war would go on. It would end in 1865, and it would end at Appomattox Courthouse on the beloved Virginia soil of both of these men who have talked to you tonight. Before the Civil War, people referred to us as those United States. After the war, they referred to us as the United States. And we thank Michigan for the part that she saw fit to play in helping us keep this great country together so that there truly would be a future as the last best hope of earth. Well, this policy would go ahead to other generations, and there would be that man called Roosevelt. And his father, worked for me hard in the campaign of 1860. He was a New York City, and he was a financier and a man who helped support the Lincoln cause to get me in the office. No one could have dreamed then that he would have a young son who would come along and be called Teddy. And that Teddy Roosevelt would become a president of the United States. And I'm happy at this time to welcome this man into our presence.
Mr. Jefferson.
Pleasure.
Mr. Washington.
General, sir.
Well, General Washington. You can refer to me as Colonel. Mr. Washington, I'd personally like to thank you for your foresight and that instrument that governs this great nation of ours. Mr. Jefferson, I've often spoken ill of you, but I must say this. I have great admiration for your foresight in purchasing the Louisiana Territory, for if not he had done that, we would not be gathered here in East Grand Rapids High School in the great state of Michigan this evening. Mr. Lincoln, I heartily thank you for keeping this great nation of ours together, for your tireless efforts, and I might add, at the price of your life eventually. We are not, and never shall be, a government of the plurocracy. We are not, and never shall be, a government of a mob. We are a nation ruled by laws laid down by our Constitution. My friends, in order to be a good American, first you must be a good citizen. I understand there are Boy Scouts in the audience tonight. Is that true? No, they didn't make it. Well, that's too bad. But on the whole, there is no finer instrument in producing good citizens than the Boy Scout movement and Girl Scout movement in this great nation of ours. You know, there's nothing outstanding or brilliant about my career. There really isn't, except perhaps this. Whenever I find something's right, I act. Going back to my early days in the Assembly in the state of New York in my 20s, where I rose like a rocket, for I got up on the floor and challenged the legislator on certain things. Of course, I incurred a tragedy. You see, 2 days after my beloved wife Alice delivered a beautiful baby girl, which we named Alice, 2 days after that, on Valentine's Day, both my mother and my beloved wife Alice passed away in the same house, 6 hours apart. When my dearest died, the light had gone from my life forever. How do you overcome something like that? Sir, you have any idea you'd overcome something like that? Well, let me tell you. And tell you all. A man could have two kinds of problems. One that can be fixed and one that cannot. Now, I suggest the sooner you start working on the problem that can be fixed, the better off you shall feel. As for the problem that cannot be fixed, the sooner you move on, the better off you shall feel. I spent 2 years cattle ranching out in the Dakotas, in a little town called Medora. I'll tell you right now, my friends, if were not for my time spent in experiences in North Dakota, I never would have become President of the United States. I did not run, or as our Excellency here would say, stand for the presidency. I came about it in a rather unusual way. You see, as governor of New York, I was a little bit too much of a reformer for Boss Platt, United States Senator from New York. In fact, I believe his exact words were, "I want that man out of my state." Reluctantly, I accepted to run on McKinley's ticket for his second term. Oh, I think I'd rather be anything else than a president. And Mr. Jefferson can back me up on this. You weren't very fond of the office, were you?
No, sir. In fact, the second happiest day of my life was when I took leave of that great burden.
All right. Just a yes or no would suffice. I think I'd almost want to be anything else. Perhaps a history professor, then vice president. I remember Mark Hanna, senator from Ohio. His statement was, "My God, there's but one heartbeat between that damn cowboy and this nation of ours." Well, I suppose, although it wouldn't be proper, definitely be out of school for me to say, but I should thank one gentleman from Michigan, one Leon Shogash, who worked in the lumber camps in the state, an anarchist who dispatched McKinley at the Pan American Exposition in 1901. On September 14th, upon McKinley's passing, I was sworn in as our 26th president in the city of Buffalo in New York. Now, it's a dreadful thing, my friends. It's a dreadful thing to ascend to the presidency in that manner, but it would have been a far worse thing to have been mortal. And I'll tell you this, no man has enjoyed being president more than I. I don't believe I absurd executive power, but I do believe I greatly broadened its use. Well, for the betterment for our citizens, fighting for legislation that protected free commerce, to bust the trust and the malefactors of great wealth, to put aside land for our children's children. It's not what we have that will make us a great nation. It is the way in which we use it. We are not building this nation of ours, but for a day. It's the last of the ages. I believe the nation behaves wisely if it treats its natural resources as assets which it must, to know the next generation, increase in value and not impaired. Oh, I recognize the right and duty of this generation to use and develop our natural resources. But I do not recognize the right to rob by wasteful use the generations that follow. Our United States Navy. There's an old West African proverb that goes, speak softly, carry a big stick, and you shall go far. If we were to keep at the highest pitch a thorough, modern, and efficient Navy, then that should make the peace of this nation go far. I believe the greatest service I rendered towards peace was sending the battle fleet around the world. Another one of my accomplishments was a little ditch. Anybody know where? Yes. Shaved off 8,000 miles around South America, both for commerce and for defensive purposes. Now, I suppose the proper thing would have been to send Congress a report, nothing less than 200 pages, and leave Congress to debate the report. Instead, I took the isthmus and left Congress to debate me. And they're welcome to debate me as long as they want, so far as the canal goes on. I'm sure you gentlemen have had your problems with the legislative branch of our government, have you not? Well, of course, one of the solutions, 3 weeks after I left the presidency, I promised to send back the first lion I should come across, release in Congress to perform its duty. My friends, the presidency of this nation is a hard and responsible job, but you can have a great deal of fun with it too, and you can create good things. You know, far better it is to dare mighty things, and they often accuse me of daring mighty things, to win glorious triumphs, although checkered by failure, and to take rank with those poor spirits that neither enjoy much nor suffer much, for they dwell in that great twilight that knows not victory nor defeat. The only man, I repeat, the only man who makes no mistakes is the man who does nothing. I thank you for coming this evening, and I believe, Mr. Whitney, are you to make an announcement here? Are we going to do that part, or should I? All right, very well. I've never turned down the bully pulpit yet. My friends, we encourage you to ask questions this evening. Who makes history? Who makes history? What did happen? People. Are we not people, the four of us? So ask questions about our life. You know, besides just the presidency. We all had interesting lives, and we're more than pleased to share it with you. I want you to conduct yourself during this question and answer period as you would conduct yourself in a football game. In other words, don't flinch, don't foul, but hit the line hard. Promise me that? Thank you.
Thank you very much for very insightful and entertaining glimpses into your lives. Now, we do encourage you to ask questions, and we have microphones at the end of this aisle, and also for those of you up in the balcony, right in the middle. So as you queue up, please do so now, and we will alternate among the microphones. And while you are queuing up, I would like to ask the first question of each of you gentlemen. Would you please tell the audience, what you regard as your greatest achievement?
You said you had fun during the presidency?
Only good fun, sir. Well, life is a great adventure.
Very different presidencies. Forgive me, sir. I would tell you that the thing that I am most prideful of, and I try not to be prideful, but it may surprise you, It has nothing to do with my public service. It has to do with my home. There is nothing that I hold with greater esteem or more pride than my beloved Mount Vernon. It is the only place I have ever wanted to be, sitting under my own vine and my own fig tree. But alas, in my life, all roads lead away from Mount Vernon. I have found that I have been repeatedly faced with the choice between inclination and duty, and of course, I have always answered the call of duty. But surprisingly, sir, it is Mount Vernon. Mr. Jefferson?
I would concur with His Excellency. And for me, I hope all my days will end where I assure you my wishes do, at Monticello. No other place, in my experience, can take the place of my native woods and fields. And yet, I would say, Mr. Whitney, my greatest achievement without question has been acquiring the hand of Mrs. Jefferson in marriage. No, I can assure you this, I've always believed harmony in the marriage state is the first chapter in the Book of Wisdom. And it is certainly achieved when two individuals make it their personal duty to make the other happy. What a very simple formula for universal happiness and harmony within the marriage state. I will never forget when I first set eyes on the slender form, the gracious persona of Miss Martha Wales there when I entered Williamsburg City that winter of 1759 and 1760, and yet I discovered within a short time she was already spoken for by a classmate of mine at William and Mary, Mr. Batter Skelton, and yes, when Bat left the college they were married. But 2 years later, Bat died quite suddenly in a carriage accident out on the road to Jamestown, and the widow Skelton then went into her seclusion for about a year. I will never forget, nearly a year later, I was riding down the Duke of Gloucester Street. I heard the most melodious sound of a spinet coming out of a parlor window in the distance. Well, I recognized the melody. In fact, so did my horse. He took me swiftly in that direction. And when we arrived, I dismounted, went up onto the porch, and there was the graceful form of the widow Skelton seated at the spinet. I knew then she must be coming out of her seclusion. So I made a rap on the door. The servant girl attended. I inquired of her whether the widow Skelton would enjoy Mr. Jefferson to accompany her on his violin. And she went in and returned to the affirmative. She would be delighted, sir. And thereby I engaged nearly an hour's musicale with the widow Skelton. And as I took my leave, the very same servant girl, upon handing me my hat, said, "Mr. Jefferson, you might be the further delighted to know that during your musicale I observed two gentlemen approaching in this direction, though still at a distance. You desisted in your accompaniment at that moment. The widow proceeded in her solo. I saw the oddest thing. The ears of these gentlemen's horses perked up and took them swiftly in this direction. And when they arrived, both of them jumped off the horses, ran up onto the porch, ready to knock on the door at the same time, when it was then the music of your violin was heard co-joined with the music of the spinet, and I distinctly saw the one gentleman look to the other in disgust as he lowered his hand and said, "But too late, Jefferson's gotten here before us." It is a true story that I'm delighted to share with you, and yet I lament to inform you that as Mrs. Jefferson bore us 6 children, she found childbirth to be of a great labor. We could never understand why in childbirth she craved sugar more than usual, why our babies weighed the heavier consecutively, one after the other, to the extent our last child, a little girl, Lucy Elizabeth, weighed 12 pounds at birth. Mrs. Jefferson did not survive, but not before. I promised her on her deathbed I would never marry again. And I continued, as you know, to uphold that promise. No, I have often said at that moment I lost my dearest companion, that the future could not possibly hold any further happiness for me, and that no man could have experienced but 10 short years of uncheckered happiness. That is my greatest achievement, sir, even in its sorrow.
And though I've much appreciated my years in it, there isn't any place in the world like home, like Sagamore Hill. There can be no more healthier or pleasanter place in which to bring up small children than that nook of old-time America that lies around Sagamore. My friends, there are a great many successes, achievements, and attainments to gather during one's lifetime. It's exceedingly interesting to be a successful businessman, a railroad man, a factory man, a lumberman, a rancher, a hunter of grizzly bears or lions, a colonel of a fighting regiment, president of the United States. But if things go reasonably well, a household full of children make all other successes and achievements and attainments lose their importance by comparison.
Well, I may be put on the spot here because I could talk about my family, my 4 boys. 2 of them died before they were 11. 3 of them died before they were 17, and Mrs. Lincoln was left with a situation where she was emotionally distressed. I had inscribed upon her wedding ring, "Love is eternal." And that was true. That was true in my feeling of her. But I suppose if I could get away from that family line just ever so briefly, I would say that what brought me the real happiness was keeping this great country together. And if you have to put it in an A-B situation, while I'll be remembered for the Emancipation Proclamation, that never would have happened had we not kept the nation together. So always place them A and B, keeping the Union together and giving a race of people freedom.
We have a leadership academy at Grand Valley State University where we study you and try to understand your success. I'd like to hear from each of you. What was the key to your leadership? How did you get where you got, and how did you lead? I guess what was the key characteristic that made people look to you for leadership?
Would you like to lead off, Tom?
Well, sir, I think appropriately so, as you have ever remained an icon of proper and devoted leadership for myself, let alone for the nation. I know, sir, that we've had various disagreements, but you always recognize, sir, that as Americans we can agree to disagree, and you've always encouraged in the midst of the disagreements that we continue that most noble representation of who we are to the rest of the world, that we can pursue through our disagreements compromise and resolution for the common good. You exemplified to me that indeed the integrity of one's personal character is essential for a leader, that emanates more than anything else, somewhat as a halo to everyone else in observation. And as well, and you have always exemplified to me that in every sense of the words that you remained a very good and a very wise man. Perhaps, sir, if you will, for me personally, in that light, I consider leadership to represent not one's own personal commentary on their achievements, no, nay indeed, but rather one's own personal commentary on the achievements of others. And though I've been recognized as surely one responsible for the purchase of over 830,000 square miles west of the Mississippi, purchase of the island of New Orleans, which gains us the control of one of the mightiest waterways upon the globe, nay, even in the midst of the attacks by the Federalists that I usurped the authority of my office in that effort, the Louisiana Treaty could not be solely ratified by me. And it arrived to my desk on the 14th of July, 1803. It proceeded right where the Constitution says it should go. The Senate. The Senate. It was the achievement of the Senate of the United States. And the negotiations which led to it in France were not attended to by me, no. Those negotiations were attended by 2 particular individuals, one not even of our soil. The one successful individual in those negotiations was indeed my fellow committeeman on the committee to draft our Declaration of American Independence, the gentleman I appointed Minister Plenipotentiary to France, Robert R. Livingston. And the other, a Frenchman himself, who was welcome to seek an asylum on our soil, who brought his 2 sons here that they might indeed begin to taste the sweetness of liberty, and one of them to engage the manufacture of the finest gunpowder the world could possibly know for our defense. That gentleman, who was a friend of General Bonaparte and later became one of his personal bankers during his rise to his self-proclaimed royal office. That gentleman was Pierre Samuel Dupont. It was Monsieur Dupont who helped me to understand, rather than to attempt to raise arms and thereby claim the Mississippi, let alone the land to the west, why not let it be suggested these United States will be willing to purchase New Orleans and the territory of Louisiana. Though it took me some time to make up my mindset, I did finally have to acquiesce and thereby accept what indeed seemed the more practicable. I make these statements in your presence, in the presence of my fellow chief magistrates, in the presence of all of you, honestly and sincerely, because, if you will, sir, I do believe that the true art in government is simply in being honest.
There is no big trick to leadership, really. There are certain principles that one must follow. For instance, judge everybody on their merit and not who they are. Surround yourself with knowledgeable people and study history. The nation's possibility of achieving greatness lies in the present, and nothing helps it more to achieve that possible greatness than its consciousness of past achievements and past mistakes. You learn from them. I'll give you one short example. When I first went out to the Dakotas, I was quite a character, quite a sight. In my buckskin outfit, and my Tiffany hunting knife, my wide sombrero. But when I blurted out, "Hasten forward there, hasten forward," one of the first roundups, I was laughed at. Imagine that. But I quickly gained the respect from the cowboys out there because I held my own. I put in the same hours, suffered the same hardships. I went into a saloon to check into the hotel above in the town of Mingus. There were shots as I approached the building. There was a bully, drunk out of his mind, and shot the clock off the wall. I went in, sat down, and minded my own business. Right away, he fixated on me and said something to the effect, "I say, Four Eyes, you're buying the house the next round." Is that worth getting into a fight over? See, good leadership is know when and when not to use force. He repeated, "I said you're buying the house the next round." Still not worth getting into a fight over. But if you're able to take care of yourself, don't hesitate to take care of yourself. I gave him about as much rope as I was going to give him. I got up, led with a right, and followed through with a solid left, and knocked him out cold. And ever since then, I've been known as Old Four Eyes. These are a few points that I pass on to you about leadership. Use them wisely.
Well, I think that leadership is in the eyes of the beholder, what he or she sees in another individual to consider leadership. But I think one of them is determination, stick-to-itiveness, see it through. And certainly when I was president, if we were going to have this union, we had to see it through in the darkest times. And in those times in December of 1862, following a terrible defeat at Chancellorsville, I had to tell the press, I had to tell the wounded who survived Chancellorsville, or Fredericksburg as I should have said, that there was going to be a turnaround, and we were going to come back, and we were going to win this thing. when we came to December after Fredericksburg, and I said Chancellorsville earlier, I meant in Fredericksburg, that was the most dismal time of the war. And yet we had to pick ourselves up and go on. And I learned some of that from the man on my far right, because of all the accolades that will go down to George Washington, and how people will remember him at his beloved Mount Vernon, and all of the things he did to start this country and to get us underway. There has to be one date in his mind that would be the darkest, that he would never, never forget. And that was September the 11th. Because in September the 11th, 1777, this man was at Brandywine with his troops. General Howe of the British Army came by vessel up the Chesapeake, offloaded, and almost annihilated him on September the 11th. He was able to pull his troops back to Paoli. Suddenly the British turned and left them alone and marched into Philadelphia. So we can have bad times. I had mine, he had his. Mr. Jefferson certainly had his. And Mr. Roosevelt would tell us about some of his difficult times. They happen to all of us. It's whether you're down and pick yourself back up and demonstrate that to your colleagues and the people who are relying on you for leadership.
You know, Mr. Lincoln, when you talk about Brandywine Creek and our loss there, and General Sir William Howe's conquering of Philadelphia, our nation's capital, I am put in mind in a humorous fashion of the news reaching Dr. Benjamin Franklin that General Howe had captured Philadelphia. Franklin was in Paris. Franklin said, "General Howe has not captured Philadelphia. Philadelphia has captured General Howe." That is a story for another day. But I do not disagree with anything these gentlemen have said with regard to leadership. I would add the following. We should never lose sight of virtue, integrity, and honor in leadership. And these are not just words, they are calls to action. And if I would summarize my personal belief with regard to leadership, indeed, the actions in my life in general, it is simply deeds, not words.
A question for General Washington, Mr. Jefferson, of your impressions and Mr. Jefferson's friendship with Thomas Paine.
With who?
With Thomas Paine, sir. Mr.
Oh,
Paine.
I'm sorry, I could not hear you. The corset maker.
Sir, you've already begun to speak of Thomas.
You know, Thomas, I must admit I have had a great amount of that American beverage today, coffee. And so I am uncharacteristically out of control. I apologize.
Your Excellency, I've always considered coffee to be the drink of the civilized world. Perhaps this has lifted your spirits then to be the more vociferous than usual.
Perhaps.
I understand it is my place now to speak. The most felicitous pen I have ever known, the pen of Thomas Paine. I was first introduced to him in Philadelphia City the spring of 1776. He had been here but a year. He had printed in that city his pamphlet, the Common Sense. Indeed, it was more readily received into the hands of the citizenry than anything ever published in America before, save the Holy Roll in various translations. I was quite taken by his documents, and in my very first meeting with him, sir, having, of course, the privilege of an education, a Latin school, an English academy, the Old World College of William and Mary, reading law with Mr. George Witt in Williamsburg, I pondered which author throughout human history has been his greatest inspiration. And when I put forth this question unto Mr. Paine, do you know, he replied to me in that bold Irish accent of his. He said, "Sir," he said, "my inspiration has been found in the taverns, inns, and ordinaries of America. The people, the common man.
In your presidency, have you ever picked out one event that was kind of a lucky break, that helped change things, that moved things ahead during your presidency?
You know, Madam, I am put to mind once again of our glorious contest, which of course ultimately led to the presidency. I do not believe that one can look at the events of our years leading up to American independence and the great contest that occurred afterwards without the fact that one would believe in the interposition of divine providence. There are countless examples during our War of Independence where we should have been defeated. It should have been over. I will cite just two that occurred in one day. We are meeting the British at Brooklyn Heights. I have covered all of the possible means of attack, save for one small road. The British provide a feint. We think it is the vanguard of the entire army. It is not. The entire army is marching behind us on that one small road. And so they are having the Lord Harry with us. And they push us back to our breastworks. They are 600 feet from us, and they stop. Night was beginning to fall. It was just dusky, madam. Had they pressed their advantage, the war might have been over then and there. They did not. That same evening, with the American army behind its breastworks, the British 600 feet away, my entire army, under the cover of not just the darkness, madam, but the fog that had set in, retreats across the East River under the very bowsprits of the British Navy onto the Manhattan Island. Only one of countless examples. So that is what comes to mind. During the presidency, keeping Jefferson and Hamilton apart was a miracle.
Should the President of the United States have a line item veto?
A line item veto? I have no idea. Do you want to explain it to us? What does that mean, a line item veto? Is it something, an item for sale? Beg pardon?
I think we ought to have Theodore Roosevelt explain what a line item veto is. You had some challenges with budgets.
Of all my accomplishments, money was not one of them. Ask Mother, my second wife, Edith. She would give all the children, including me, an allowance each day. I'd promptly spend it and ask for more, and she'd say, Theodore, you've had yours for today, you have to wait for tomorrow. I just don't know where it goes, Edie. I just don't know where it goes. We did have a panic in 1907. Believe it or not, one of the malefactors of great wealth, J.P. Morgan, acted as our Federal Reserve and pulled us out of that panic. Fortunately, I relied on qualified people to take care of the finances of this great nation. Although I was involved in the veto that I did not sign, I'll explain. You see, Congress was going to prohibit the chief executive of this nation from signing away land to put under federal protection. Now, I could have signed that veto, but what happens? You know, I could have vetoed it. But what would happen? It would just go back into the process and make more fuss than necessary and eventually be signed at some point in time. The prudent thing was, several weeks before I had to sign that veto, I had leading naturalists and my good friend Gifford Pinchot, our chief forester, a position I created, at the White House with all kinds of maps laid out to pick out at the last moment lands worth saving. So I put aside quite a number of acres before I had to sign that veto. Petra, always use the veto power carefully.
This question is for General Washington and President Jefferson. You've heard from President Lincoln what became of the nation during his time and during his presidency. Do you think that's due to some flaws in the Constitution that you created and weren't able to cover? And was that Constitution meant to be a living document that would be changed later, or a document that's set in stone, everything in it should be interpreted the same over time? Thank you.
Ma'am, I will tell you, in my opinion, we should ever recognize that we become different people every day. We are different people this evening in our associations than His Excellency and myself knew in our very first meeting. We were different people in 1776, several years after that first meeting. We were different people in the very first presidential election, that under our Constitution, and His Excellency was elected, and certainly different people a decade later, when I was elected the third Chief Magistrate. You ought to ask me whether our system of government and law should remain stagnant and not go anywhere. I was concerned about that, yes, when I received that letter aforementioned from Mr. Madison. Oh, you heard my reply. I thought it was an extraordinary document, surely. And yet, I wrote back to Mr. Madison, it lacks something. It lacks something that allows that Constitution to grow. Otherwise, it is stagnant. It does not go anywhere, and it can be read by any government in office to its own particular interests. I said what is necessary for the Constitution is what all people are entitled to, against any government upon the globe. For I said what is necessary is a Bill of Rights. A Bill of Rights. Do you know that Mr. Madison wrote back to me that the rights are inferred in the Constitution? There is no need for them to be written down. And I wrote back immediately, are we to rest upon inference on such an important subject as our rights as citizens, recognizing that the government cannot exist without our approbation, the honorarium that we provide unto it in elective office? Oh, Mr. Madison and I had several communications. He believed that to pronounce these rights is therein, in the pronouncement, to limit them. That they can therein receive opposition, argument, and debate. And yet, I reminded Mr. Madison that we are free in nature to declare, and therefore should declare these rights to be the inalienable rights of the family man across the globe. I believe, though Madison has changed my mind on many opinions, that one, my own, was of great influence unto him. And therefore, yes, as I said earlier, our Constitution is living and breathing, and it grows as we grow as a people. Now, I'm not an advocate for frequent changes in laws and institutions, but when, over time, they begin to prohibit the further growth of either man's intellect, his health, or his happiness, well, yes, they should be reviewed. And though I have written it, it is not my own statement. A revolution is a good thing every generation or so. The tree of liberty should be continually refreshed with the blood of patriots as well as of tyrants. That was Montesquieu who wrote that. And yet I hope we do not forget, though revolution in human history may imply revolt, rebellion, bloodshed, rather we should examine that over the great scheme of things, revolution is simply the revolving back to the essential elements of liberty and freedom. And that has been shown through human history to be the most successfully achieved by the stroke of a pen than ever by the stroke of a sword.
We have time just for two more questions. The question here and on that side.
Mr. Jefferson, perhaps you could comment on your feelings about the fact that today we refer to you as the founder of the Democratic Party in our country.
Democratic Party. Oh, I declare.
I will tell you, sir, that I can comment on the fact that we should not have political parties in this country. We should have consensus. That does not mean we should not have debate and discourse. We should. But we should have consensus around the spirit of 70 and 6. I believe that political parties, as characterized by Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Hamilton in my second term, are divisive. I believe it does not bode well for this nation. I believe that politicians, by their nature, twistify the very engines that put them into office. They concern themselves with their own welfare and that of their friends, and the common welfare a very distant second. And now we shall hear from a politician. I was thinking of Mr. Roosevelt, Tom.
I am certain that a great democracy has got to be progressive, which could be either Republican, Democrat, Whig, or whatever else, as long as it's progressive. For if it's not, it'll soon cease to be either great or a democracy.
You were going to say, sir?
He almost took the words right out of my mouth. And here I thought he was a Federalist all along. Your Excellency, Mr. Lincoln, Mr. Roosevelt, citizens, I can assure you this. We should never, ever denigrate politics and politicians. It is the lifeblood, if you will, of our effort to improve our condition and, we hope, make more efficient the methods of our government. It is an art, an ancient art, of compromise and resolution for the common good. Your Excellency, we have argued and debated long, indeed, upon this particular subject, and
it is true.
And I can say that General Hamilton and myself have exemplified in your particular cabinet perhaps the two diverging opinions of the American identity. That which is wont to reflect on what has been accomplished in human history, particularly the great success of all the world's empires engaged by Great Britain herself in trade, political economy, and cooperation. Yes, I will not deny that. But I do not believe that the principles of our American Revolution were to hark backward to the ages of the darkest ignorance in order to find the greatest improvement, or to think that anything that might have been created in the past cannot be improved upon and bettered for the future of generations yet unborn. And therefore, yes, I argue on behalf of further securing, protecting, and defending those principles, to recognize the common man in all things and the equal opportunity bestowed on mankind by our Creator, who indeed has not created us equal in our face and our form, nor in our mental capacities, but rather has created us free. He who gave us life, gave us liberty at the same time, desires an equal opportunity unto all in the family of man. And therein and thereupon, though we should energize our nation in commerce, let us not forget the farm. 9 out of every 10 Americans seated on their farms, engaging the cultivation of the soil, the most noble occupation for mankind. For therein, and I ask you, who knows better how to hold the reins of self-government and answer the call of our nation to protect both person and property?
Mr. Jefferson, I find this a rare occasion where I agree with you on something, to hold the reins. Yes, but you must remember, my friends, political offices are not the property of politicians at all. Because you're quite right, Your Excellency, they do twistify if you let them. Political offices belong to the men and women of this great nation. It is up to you to see that they are filled for the service of the men and women of this great nation.
But I wanted to say that I mused a little bit in that question, because the gentleman asked you if now you wouldn't be a, what did he say, a Democrat?
He called me the founder of the Democratic Party, Mr. Lincoln. And though indeed we became known in your cabinet as anti-federalist in our opposition to General Hamilton and his financial schemes.
Well, that makes you a Democrat in my eyes.
And though, Mr. Lincoln, we became known as thereby democratical Republicans. Oh, I can assure you this, during the 8 years of my administration, we were known simply as Jeffersonian Republicans. And yes, sir.
But I was the first Republican president, and I sometimes get asked that question, wouldn't you now be a Democrat? And you know how I answered?
Sir.
I said, well, two men were at a New Year's Eve party and came a little inebriated. And when they got outside, they got into a fisticuffs. And after the fight, each one came up in the other man's overcoat. So I really don't think that people understand quite what we stood for in our respective times. We kept our own coats on.
We kept our own coats, Mr. Lincoln, and that is why I've often answered, whether I be called the father of the Democratic Party, or I've heard often that you referred all honor and glory to me as a true Republican, whether we be called Republicans, whether we be called liberal or conservative, whether we be called indeed Whig or Tory, I have pronounced oft times, Your Excellency, as you know. I hope to be known, and I hope my political platform may continue to be known, simply as the spirit of 76, that we have not forgotten the principles of our American Revolution.
Hi, I'm really into ballet, and I just wanted to know if you have ever seen a ballet, or which one ballet you have seen.
Have we seen a ballet?
Why did you begin your inquiry with the word hi? Were you referring to something?
Did you ask about the ballet?
If we had seen a ballet, Mr.
Oh, we certainly were familiar with the ballet, Mrs. Lincoln and I can remember a terrible tragedy at Ford Theater in Washington City. This was in 1862. A ballet troupe was visiting Ford's Theater, and there was a tremendous fire, and they lost all of their sets and their costuming. So yes, we knew ballet, and the ballet visited Washington City every once in a while.
As I have written, the most delicate and delightful element of art in the human form. And I was privileged to see a number of ballets during the 5 years that I was in France. Yes, Your Honor.
I remember you describing it to me. I was jealous, if truth be told. I enjoy theater greatly, and Mr. Roosevelt and I were talking earlier. He enjoys theater, and I understand you are very much.
Oh, we love it. I love the opera. We attended Ford's Theater after it was repaired, and I saw Gounod's Faust 3 times in March when it was here. The opera of Faust appeared in Washington. I love the opera.
Well, you keep enjoying the theater, sir.
Yes.
Are you dedicated to the arts?
Yes, I am. Besides hunting grizzlies and lions, I do champion the arts. And not for my badgering to Congress, we would not have a national portrait gallery.
Well done, sir. Well done.
I champion all the American arts. And by the way, I wish you well. I wish you well in your career in the ballet.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. This was a very enlightening evening.